Everything you will hear in this video really happened. The events, locations, and crimes are real. Some parts may be dramatized, but their content is documented and verified. Some descriptions may be disturbing, as reality and death show no regard for sensitivities. Welcome to Hide the Evidence.
The first sounds Bianca Devins ever knew were not lullabies, but the percussive violence of a home coming apart at the seams. Born in 2001 in Utica, New York, her infancy was cradled in a tension so thick it stifled the air, a household where love and fear were tragically intertwined. Her father's rage was a weather system all its own, unpredictable and devastating, with her mother as its primary target. The little girl learned the geography of her own home by its hiding spots, the muffled sounds of impact and choked sobs from the next room mapping a childhood defined by terror. Those early, formative years etched deep grooves of trauma not just into her mother, but into Bianca and her younger sister, their wide eyes absorbing scenes no child should ever witness. Even as a toddler, there was a profound stillness to Bianca that went beyond quiet contemplation. While other children erupted in giggles or tantrums with the natural volatility of youth, Bianca's moods were deep, dark wells. She could sit for hours, her small hands idle, her gaze fixed on nothing, a profound apathy settling over her like a shroud. Then, without warning, the stillness would shatter into storms of inconsolable weeping or fits of frustration that seemed to come from a place of bottomless despair. These were not the simple mood swings of a growing child. They were the early tremors of a profound internal fracture. Her mother, scarred but fiercely protective, recognized the shadows gathering in her eldest daughter. She became a pilgrim in a desperate, wearying quest for answers, shuttling a somber Bianca from one specialist's office to another. They sat in sterile waiting rooms with worn magazines, the hum of fluorescent lights a constant companion. Doctors spoke of adjustment disorders, of possible anxiety, their diagnoses vague and shifting like smoke. They prescribed various therapies and, later, medications, but nothing seemed to touch the core of the darkness that clung to the girl. Each failed attempt was a small death of hope, a confirmation that the battle Bianca was fighting was one nobody else could fully see or understand. The family home, even after her father was no longer a physical presence, remained a monument to his damage. The emotional scars he left behind were phantom limbs, still causing pain long after the source was gone. Bianca's younger sister reacted with a nervous, watchful anxiety, while Bianca herself retreated further inward, building fortresses of silence around her hurting heart. Her mother watched this divergence with annoying helplessness, seeing the same foundational cracks express themselves in different architectures of pain. She continued her vigil, her love a constant, desperate counterpoint to the unseen illness slowly claiming her daughter from the inside out. A silent war waged in the quiet suburbs of Utica, its first casualties being a little girl's joy and her sense of safety in the world. Adolescence did not soften the world for Bianca, it sharpened its edges. The chaotic landscape of high school, with its brutal social hierarchies and relentless pressure, became a funhouse mirror, distorting and amplifying the internal turmoil she had carried since childhood. The profound apathy of her youth curdled into a more active anguish, a roiling sea of emotional extremes where a single perceived slight could feel like a cataclysm, and a moment of connection could evaporate into a vacuum of worthlessness. Her mood swung with a violent, unpredictable pendulum, leaving wreckage in their wake, strained friendships, frantic texts to her mother, and long, hollowed-out nights where the darkness felt less like an absence of light and more like a physical presence in her room. The foundation of pain laid in her earliest years was now a crumbling cliff face, and she was teetering on the edge. The breaking point arrived not with a scream, but with a devastating quiet. In 2018, after a particularly severe spiral that left her family terrified and her own resources utterly depleted, Bianca was admitted for an intensive psychiatric evaluation. It was in the stark, clinical light of this new setting that the vague specters of her childhood finally took a definitive, named form. The diagnosis was a dual-edged revelation: borderline personality disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. The words were clinical, cold, but for her mother, they were a key after years of fumbling with the wrong locks. They provided a map, however daunting, of the treacherous territory they had been lost in for so long. The unseen battle now had a known enemy. Following the diagnosis, Bianca entered a residential treatment center, a world away from the familiar chaos of Utica. The environment was structured, its rhythms deliberate and calm, a stark contrast to the tempest within her. Initially, she retreated, a sullen and resistant silhouette against the institutional walls. But then she met her counselor, a woman whose calm demeanor felt less like a professional facade and more like an unshakable truth. She did not flinch from Bianca's anger or her bottomless grief. In that office, Bianca found a space where her pain was not a burden to be managed but a reality to be understood, and slowly, tentatively, she began to lower her defenses. The core of her treatment became dialectical behavior therapy, a regimen that felt less like talk and more like learning a new language for living. She filled notebooks with skills: distress tolerance, emotion regulation, interpersonal effectiveness. She learned to identify the tsunami of an emotion before it crested, to ground herself in the physical world when her thoughts threatened to spiral into the abyss. It was grueling, repetitive work, and progress was not a straight line but a series of fragile gains and painful setbacks. Yet there were moments of breakthrough, small but significant. The first time she navigated a moment of conflict without self-harm, the first morning she woke and did not immediately feel the weight of her own existence as a punishment. By February 2019, Bianca was deemed stable enough to return home. She was not cured. The disorders were a part of her, a chronic condition to be managed, but she was armed. She carried her DBT binder like a shield and the phone number of her counselor like a talisman. The girl who came home was more solid, more present. She finished her high school requirements, the graduation certificate a tangible testament to a resilience she had rarely felt. In the quiet of her reclaimed bedroom, she began to look toward a future she had never dared to envision. She researched college programs, her focus settling on psychology. The thought of turning her own suffering into a tool to help others, of offering someone else the lifeline she had been given, planted a fragile but tenacious seed of hope. It was a quiet rebellion, a declaration that her story would not be defined solely by its pain, but by her fight against it. The glowing screen of her phone became a portal, a refuge from the treacherous landscape of her own mind. When the world outside felt too sharp, too loud, or too demanding, Bianca would retreat into the digital ether, her fingers dancing across the glass, building a life in pixels and curated posts. Tumblr, with its sprawling, anonymous communities of shared melancholy and aestheticized pain, was her first haven. She found a strange comfort in the Gothic imagery and poetic despair, a sense that her own darkness was not unique, but part of a larger, understood tapestry. It was a world where her borderline personality disorder and PTSD were not stigmatized illnesses, but facets of a complex identity, romanticized and shared in cryptic text posts and moody selfies. Her presence soon rippled outward to Discord servers and, most prominently, Instagram. On Instagram, she crafted a persona that was both vulnerable and alluring, a carefully filtered version of herself that drew people in. She posted pictures of her dyed hair, her anime-inspired makeup, her small, wistful smiles. The engagement was a drug, the likes and comments a fleeting validation that momentarily filled the void. But this attention was not monolithic. It curdled at the edges. A small, persistent following of older men began to coalesce around her profile, her orbiters. They were a disparate group, united only by their obsessive fixation on the young woman on their screens. Some were seemingly benign, sending her gifts, art supplies, plush toys, expensive cosmetics that arrived in anonymous packages. These tokens felt, for a moment, like kindness, a digital approximation of care that she so desperately craved. But the orbiter's fascination was a fickle and dangerous thing. The same men who once flooded her direct messages with flattery could turn on a dime, their admiration souring into a venomous sense of entitlement when she failed to reciprocate their imagined intimacy. Their messages shifted from praise to demands, from gifts to threats. They dissected her every post, searching for hidden meanings and perceived slights. The digital refuge began to feel like a panopticon, with countless unseen eyes watching, judging, and waiting for a misstep. The most profound betrayal, however, was not from a stranger, but from a past she had tried to leave behind. A former relationship with a boy named Rob had ended, but its digital ghost remained, a malignant specter he had unleashed. In an act of ultimate violation, Rob had recorded an intimate video of them together and, after their split, posted it online without her consent. The clip was a piece of her soul, stolen and weaponized. It did not take long for the orbiters to find it. They seized upon it with grotesque enthusiasm, embedding it in the harassment they now weaponized against her. Their messages became laced with threats to send the video to her family, to her high school, to brand it across the internet even further than it had already spread. They held her stolen intimacy over her head like a blade, using her deepest shame as a tool for their control. The digital world, once her sanctuary, had become a labyrinth of exploitation. Every notification was a potential ambush, every direct message a possible threat. The platforms that connected her to a global community now felt like a series of locked rooms with anonymous men lurking behind every door. The hope and stability she had fought so hard to build in treatment began to erode under the constant, corrosive pressure of this online siege. The screen's glow, which once promised connection, now illuminated a chilling truth: that in the vast, borderless expanse of the internet, her pain was not just a private burden, but a currency, and her vulnerability made her a target. The internet, for all its predatory shadows, could still sometimes conjure a kindred spirit. In the early, fragile spring of 2019, as Bianca navigated the precarious balance of her newfound stability, a private message flickered onto her screen from a username she didn't recognize: Brandon Clark. He was 21, his digital presence a curated gallery of anime fan art, self-deprecating memes, and a palpable, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. Their initial exchanges were the tentative probing of two people who recognized the scent of shared damage. They spoke of favorite series, of the comfort found in fictional worlds where emotions were grand and consequences were clear, a stark contrast to the messy ambiguity of their own lives. The connection deepened rapidly, fueled by the intense, accelerated intimacy that only the digital world can foster. Soon, the conversations shifted from shared interests to shared wounds. Brandon confessed his own foundational trauma, a story that felt like a dark echo of Bianca's childhood. He spoke of a father whose violence had escalated to a terrifying climax, holding his mother hostage in their own home. The event had shattered his family, catapulting him into the transient, uncertain world of foster care. He painted a picture of a life spent feeling rootless, unseen, and permanently braced for the next disaster. Bianca listened, her heart a Chinese letter tuning fork. Here was someone who understood the architecture of a broken home, who spoke the same silent language of hypervigilance and inherited pain. In his trauma, she saw a reflection of her own, and in that reflection, a powerful, dangerous empathy was born. To her mother, watching from the periphery with a cautious hope, Brandon initially appeared as a potential anchor. He was older, employed, and his conversations with Bianca seemed to pull her out of her depressive spirals. He encouraged her art, her interest in psychology, and presented a front of supportive stability. He was a world away from the chaotic, abusive men of her mother's past and the predatory orbiters of Bianca's recent history. Her mother, desperate to see her daughter happy and connected, allowed herself a sigh of tentative relief. Perhaps this was the healthy relationship, the positive influence that could help solidify Bianca's hard-won progress. But beneath the surface of shared anime playlists and inside jokes, the bond was forged in the unstable material of mutual pathology. Their connection was not built on a foundation of health, but on the fractured bedrock of their disorders. They were two fractured people, each seeing in the other a missing piece that they believed could make them whole. Bianca, with her BPD-fueled fear of abandonment and her intense, all-consuming style of attachment, latched onto Brandon with a ferocity that mistook intensity for intimacy. Brandon, with his own unaddressed trauma and possessive tendencies, saw in Bianca not just a girlfriend, but a purpose, a possession, the one person who truly understood the depths of his pain. They existed in a self-contained universe of their own creation, a bubble sealed against the outside world by the sheer force of their shared narrative of being misunderstood survivors. Their texts were a continuous stream, a digital umbilical cord that tethered them together day and night. When they were apart, the space between them filled with an anxious energy, a need for constant reassurance that their connection remained unbroken. It was a bond that felt like a lifeline to both of them, but it was a line anchored to two drowning people. The very things that drew them together, their deep-seated trauma, their emotional instability, their desperate need to be seen, were the same forces that charged their connection with a volatile, electric current. The stability Bianca's mother saw was a mirage, obscuring the thematic undertones of a shared sickness, and a connection so fragile that its eventual collapse was not a matter of if, but when, and how catastrophically it would break. The humid July air clung to the evening like a second skin, thick with the promise of amplified bass and the collective breath of a waiting crowd. For Bianca, the plan to attend the Queen's concert was a deliberate act of normalcy, a carefully constructed bridge back to a world where teenagers did teenage things, unburdened by therapy binders and the ghosts of online tormentors. She stood in the kitchen, the request to her mother feeling both simple and monumental. Her improved stability over the past months was her most persuasive argument, a tangible thing she could hold up like a shield. Her mother, seeing the determined light in her daughter's eyes and remembering the hollowed-out girl of a year ago, agreed with a cautious nod. The presence of Brandon, who still seemed a steadying influence, provided the final thread of reassurance. Permission was granted, a small victory that felt like a leap towards the life she was fighting to claim. The journey to the venue was a cocoon of shared excitement, the car stereo pumping out the very music they would soon hear live. Brandon drove, his presence a familiar comfort, while Bianca watched the cityscape blur past her window, her heart thrumming with a nervous, hopeful energy. She had dressed with care, her makeup a work of art, her clothes a statement of the person she was trying to become. Not a patient, not a victim, but a young woman on the cusp of something. When they arrived, the energy of the crowd was a physical force, a tidal wave of youth and noise that swept her up. For a few precious hours, the constant, low-grade hum of her anxiety was drowned out by the roar of the music. She lost herself in the pulse of it, the crush of bodies, the shared, wordless communion of the audience. In the swirling chaos of the concert, she found her friends. Their group was a vibrant, laughing island in the sea of people, and among them was Alex. His smile was easy, his attention uncomplicated, a stark contrast to the intense, fraught dynamic she shared with Brandon. The chemistry between them was immediate and light, a spark that felt refreshingly simple. As the headliner took the stage and the crowd surged, they were pushed together, a natural consequence of the packed space. In a moment of pure, unthinking impulse, surrounded by the screaming guitar solo and the wash of colored lights, Bianca turned her head and their lips met. It was a brief, stolen kiss, a secret sealed in the heart of the roaring crowd, a fleeting taste of a different kind of connection, one that asked for nothing but the moment itself. But the bubble of the moment was fragile. As they pulled apart, a cold dread trickled down her spine, cutting through the concert's euphoria. Her eyes scanned the crowd and found Brandon's gaze locked onto them from a short distance away. His expression was not one of anger, but of a profound, chilling stillness, a void where the shared excitement of the night had been. The music suddenly felt deafening, the crowd suffocating. The desire for independence that had fueled her all evening curdled into a sharp, familiar fear. Later, tucked away in a corner of the venue, her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. The screen glowed, a portal back to the complicated reality she had briefly escaped. She typed a frantic message to Alex, the words a confession and a warning. "I think Brandon saw us." It was an admission that betrayed the careful story she had maintained for Brandon, that Alex was just a friend, that their bond was unique, unthreatened. The text message, sent into the digital ether, was more than a piece of information. It was a flare, signaling the violent collapse of the precarious boundary between her yearning for freedom and Brandon's desperate, consuming need to be her entire world. The thrumming echo of the concert faded into the heavy silence of the car, the transition from collective euphoria to private dread as stark as a slammed door. Exhaustion, both emotional and physical, finally claimed Bianca in the passenger seat. Her head lolled against the window, the vibrant makeup around her closed eyes smudging into the faint tracks of dried sweat. She fell into a shallow, fitful sleep, the kind that offers no true rest, while the city lights bled into long, accusatory streaks across the glass. In the driver's seat, Brandon was wide awake, the stillness in the car a vacuum filled by the frantic, silent activity on his phone. The device's cold glow illuminated the hard lines of his face, his fingers moving with a grim, deliberate purpose. He did not search for concert photos or set a route home. Instead, his queries were single-minded, clinical, and monstrous. Methods, efficiency, certainty. The digital world, the very medium that had first connected them, now provided a roadmap to her end. Satisfied, he mounted the phone on the dashboard, angling it precisely. The red recording light blinked on, a tiny, malevolent eye witnessing the final, intimate scene of their story. He did not shake her awake. His voice, when it came, was a low, flat thing that cut through her uneasy dreams. "Bianca." Her eyes fluttered open, the world swimming back into focus. The dark interior of the car, the dashboard lights, his profile silhouetted against the passing street lamps. Disorientation quickly sharpened into a cold spike of fear as she registered his tone, the unnatural set of his jaw. He did not look at her. his gaze fixed ahead on the road, but his words were aimed directly at her heart. He confronted her with the kiss, his description of it stripped of any context of music or crowd, rendering it a deliberate, personal act of treachery. He laid out the evidence of her betrayal not with shouted accusations, but with the chilling calm of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. The argument that followed was a desperate, lopsided struggle. Bianca's words tumbled out, a mixture of confused explanations and panicked denials, all of them sounding hollow and feeble in the suffocating space. She tried to frame it as a mistake, a moment of thoughtless concert chaos, but he dismantled each excuse with cold, relentless logic, quoting her own past assurances back to her. The fragile persona she had presented to him, the one who needed only his understanding, who shared a bond too profound for outsiders, was shattering before them both. Seeing the futility of her defense, her energy collapsed. The fight drained from her, leaving behind a weary, profound regret. She apologized, her voice small and broken, not for the kiss itself, but for the devastating awkwardness it had created, for ruining the night, for fracturing the impossible image of their perfect, insular world. It was the apology of someone trying to placate a force of nature, to smooth over a crack that had already split the foundation. "Please," she whispered, the words a final, desperate surrender, a retreat to the last vestige of safety she could imagine. "Please just take me home." The plea hung in the air, a fragile white flag. For a moment the only sound was the hum of the tires on asphalt. Then, movement. A flash of steel, previously concealed, caught the dim light. It was not a dramatic, sweeping gesture, but a swift, efficient, and horrifically intimate act. His arm moved and the blade found its mark. There was no scream, only a choked, wet gasp as the world dissolved into a searing, final pain. The violent betrayal was complete, a physical rending that was merely the manifestation of the emotional collapse that had been brewing for months. The trust forged in shared trauma, the bond built on unstable connections, the fragile relationship that could not withstand the pressure of a single human moment. It all ended not with an argument, but with a silence broken only by the terrible, quiet sound of a life leaving, and the unblinking red eye of the phone, faithfully recording the aftermath. The digital world, which had been both Bianca's sanctuary and her torment, became the stage for her final, grotesque violation. In the cold, blue-lit hours after her death, Brandon Clark, seated in the same car where her life had ended, methodically opened his Discord and Instagram accounts. His fingers, now stained and steady, navigated the familiar interfaces. He selected the most devastating image from the gallery on his phone, a photograph of Bianca's lifeless body, a brutal, unflinching document of his crime. He posted it for the world to see, captioning it with two hollow, performative words, "I'm sorry." With that click, he unleashed a digital plague. The image did not simply spread, it metastasized. It pulsed through servers and flooded timelines, a shockwave of horror radiating outward from that parked car. Algorithms, blind to context, promoted the engagement. On Instagram, it appeared in the feeds of her friends, her family, her small following of supporters. On Discord, it was dumped into servers dedicated to memes and anime, where initial disbelief quickly curdled into morbid fascination. The first to see it, the one whose world shattered in an instant, was her younger sister. The familiar face, rendered unfamiliar in death, stared back from the screen of her phone. A scream tore from her, a raw, primal sound of disbelief that brought their mother running. The phone was thrust into her hands, and in that single, catastrophic moment, the fragile hope she had nurtured for her daughter was annihilated, replaced by a grief so vast it had no sound. As Bianca's family descended into a nightmare, The online ecosystem continued its frenzied consumption of the tragedy. Users, shielded by anonymity, reshared the image with callous detachment, some adding cruel commentary or mocking filters. In the darkest corners of the internet, polls emerged, asking followers to vote on the authenticity of the photograph or to speculate on the gruesome details. Bianca Devins, a young woman who had fought so hard to be seen for her spirit and her struggles, was reduced in death to a piece of viral content, a spectacle for the morally bankrupt. While this digital firestorm raged, Brandon was enacting his own surreal script. He made a series of calm, disconnected phone calls to relatives, speaking not of a murder, but of a will, as if he were tidying up legal loose ends. Then, his voice eerily flat, he dialed 911 and confessed to the operator, providing his location with the detached air of someone reporting a stray animal. The police arrived to find him sitting outside the car, a self-inflicted wound at his throat, his phone propped up and live-streaming his final, desperate act to a dwindling, horrified audience. He was wrestled from the ledge of suicide, handcuffed, and taken into custody. In the subsequent search, investigators secured his phone, discovering a sealed video, the unedited first-person record of the murder itself, a piece of evidence so harrowing it would be locked away from public view, a permanent testament to the crime's intimate brutality. Days later, under a sun that felt mockingly bright, family and friends gathered to say goodbye to Bianca. Her funeral was not a somber recitation of her pain, but a celebration of the light she had fought to cultivate. They spoke of her artistic talent, her wicked sense of humor, her fierce love for her sister, and her determined, if thwarted, ambition to study psychology and help others. They remembered the girl, not the headline. In the stark, procedural world of the courtroom, Brandon initially stood and pleaded guilty, accepting a sentence of 25 years to life. But in a final, convoluted twist, he later attempted to change his plea, a maneuver that felt like one last, desperate grab for narrative control. The judge denied the request, and the original sentence was imposed, ensuring he would remain behind bars, his own life effectively extinguished. The gavel's fall brought a cold, formal close to the legal chapter, but for Bianca's mother, it was not an end. Transmuting her bottomless grief into a fierce, protective energy, she became an advocate. She spoke before legislators,